Thank you very much, Chris. So I'm excited to introduce our panel. We have Jan Garfinkle, founder and managing partner of Arboretum Ventures, and also importantly for this panel, the current chair of the National Venture Capital Association. Phil Gross, the managing director of Adage Capital Management, and Chris Viehbacher, managing partner of Gurnet Point Capital. So I thought I would start, we're going to talk a little bit about the investment environment, how it's affected things right now, but also, since we are investors, we do need to look into the future. What do things look like a year from now or maybe even 3 years down the road? So, maybe starting just to talk a little bit about how what's been going on has affected your investment, either strategy, impacted your companies, those kinds of things. So maybe starting with Jan.
Sure. Thank you, Roger. And thanks to everyone for having me here. So Arboretum Venture is a healthcare-focused venture fund, and our goal is to find companies that will drive cost out of the healthcare system, but still provide great clinical care. I founded the fund 18 years ago with that idea, and I thought it was really important then, and that was when healthcare was only 12% of GDP, and now we're up to 18, going on to 19%, so it's even more critical now. It's been really interesting, over the last couple of months, the world really has changed. A lot of our focus sort of internally has honestly been on scenario planning, helping our current existing portfolio companies, of which I think we've invested in over 55 companies over the life of Arboretum, and we have about 21 active companies right now. And those active companies are really trying to figure out how to survive over the next 12 to 18 months, with revenues being significantly down and or clinical trials stopped. And those are really the major milestones that they're been trying to hit in 2020. So we've been focused a lot on trying to help those companies. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of new companies coming at us because they're out fundraising. They maybe were in a situation where they didn't have enough cash to be able to survive through COVID. And so we're actively doing diligence at the same time we're helping our current portfolio companies. I'm looking at a heart failure company right now. One of my partners was looking at a life science tools company just recently. So we're active looking at diligence. It's a different kind of feel when we're doing diligence. Instead of being on the phone, we're doing a lot of Zoom meetings like these. And the question really will be, can we close on an investment if we can't go watch a procedure or we can't meet the management team in person? We really have prided ourselves on doing incredible diligence. And when you can't do kind of those two important pieces, the question is, can you get to a close? And I think it'll get down to, do you have trust in that management team because you've already invested with them? And or do you have trust in that syndicate that's already wrapped around that management team? And if you have those things, I think you probably can get to a close. If you don't, I think it could be a challenge.
And Phil, you spend a little bit more time in the public markets than maybe some others do. So maybe you could comment on how Adage has approached this. I think you're on mute at the moment.
From a fundamental perspective,
there you go.
In the public companies, I think that, first of all, thanks everybody for having me. I really appreciate the chance to chime in here. I think the big things that we see happening are there's clinical trials issues like what Jan was talking about. There's launching products in a virtual setting as opposed to being able to get on the road and running a marketing program. And I think that those are the fundamental elements. But then from a financing element, I think that we're learning pretty quickly how to keep the financing engine moving. In other words, there's going to be IPOs that are going to come out. There have been. There are secondaries and convertible debt offerings that are still being marketed out there without in-person meetings through Zoom and other mechanisms out there. So from that perspective, we don't see a huge disruption happening right now. We can talk a little later about mergers and acquisitions and those sorts of transactions, but at least from the other side, that's not slowing down. On the fundamental side, the other thing that everybody's wrestling with is what's happening to the biotechnology, the public biotechnology indices and companies. There's a lot of interest. There's not a lot of other places to go to invest your money. And there's also a little bit of excitement there with COVID therapies, whether it's antibodies or vaccines or antivirals, that has given a little bit of a tailwind to the biotech sector and increased valuations across the sector. So a lot of multi-industry portfolio managers see the biotechnology innovation space as a place to put their money. And I think it's actually inflating some of the values of companies that aren't necessarily directly involved in what's happening with COVID. And then even with COVID, either therapeutics or vaccines, I think that therapeutics benefit will be relatively self-contained and self-limiting. It's a couple, 3 years of maybe a therapy like remdesivir from Gilead that you won't really be able to make a significant profit on. So although those stocks are moving, it's hard from an investment perspective to understand whether that's a sustainable move. Vaccines may have a little bit more of a tail, and that's a very competitive space with 70, 80, 90 different programs in clinical trials or soon to be in clinical trials. So we're spending a lot of time there trying to figure out who might win the vaccine race going forward. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later in the presentation.
Great. And Chris, how has everything affected Gurnet Point, and what are you focused on right now?
Thanks, Roger. First, I'd echo Phil in thanking Mass General Brigham for organizing it. It's been an interesting day. And when I look at what all the healthcare professionals have been dealing with, I can assure you we haven't dealt with anything like that on the investing side. In fact, it's been largely business as usual. Healthcare is a vast market, obviously. So there's different pieces to this. I'm mostly into the therapeutics space. And that historically has been counter-correlated with the broader market. People tend to still get sick. And so in times of crisis, healthcare has been a safe haven investment. But the other thing I would say is, in the life of an early stage pharmaceutical company, 3 months is kind of a nanosecond. There's a slice of time here, but it takes years and years. So a little depends on where your company is at this point as to how disruptive you are. We have, for instance, 4 product launches in the next 18 months. I would not want to be trying to launch a product right now, for example. In terms of the actual deal making, we all know each other. It's not a huge industry. Often we've known each other for decades. And it makes it easy to switch from in-person meetings to telephone meetings or Zoom meetings. There are a few trickier spots, a little like Jan. If you have to do a site visit, we happen to sometimes acquire companies where there's a factory. So if you're going to try to do due diligence in that way, you're going to have to find a trusted individual potentially to go see the factory in whatever country you're in. But the bankers are adapting. I would agree with Phil. We're looking at a deal where we'd be raising a substantial amount of debt and equity for the deal. And it is pretty much proceeded as normal. The reality is it is a global world, and everybody, I think, has gotten used to a degree in working virtually. You might have been working virtually from your office, but you still spend an awful lot of time on the phone. Not everybody came to Boston and visited you in your office. What I think is going to be tougher is where you have to make a relationship with people you don't know. That's a little harder to build the trust relationships that are at the heart of every investment.
So maybe getting back, and you've all touched on this a little bit, social distancing obviously in the short run has affected deal making. And a couple of questions are, one, how much of this is going to stick moving forward? We had a company that went public in April, and the CEO found the Zoom Roadshow to be very efficient relative to other experiences. And as a corollary to that, some of you are here in Boston with me, and others of you are not. And does this impact the efficiency of clustering moving forward, like a Kendall Square, or do you think it will not? So maybe again, starting with you, Jan.
So we are located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and there's not a lot of clustering that goes on here. There's a little bit. We're actually in a building that has like 5 different venture funds in it. So we're actually in that same spot, or the one spot in Ann Arbor where there may be some clustering. I think the winners in this situation, honestly, are the ones that are known to be, really great investors that you want as a syndicate partner. I think it'd be really hard as a brand new venture fund, quite honestly, to be able to maybe have the same deal flow and ability to find, novel new ideas to spin out of a university or something to that effect. But I think for established venture funds that have a good reputation, the deal flow will continue. And, we specialize in medical devices and diagnostics on the one side, and then healthcare IT and life science tools, and sort of what we call pharma adjacencies on the other side. And we're really well known in all of those areas. And so I think anytime there's an entrepreneur who has an idea, we tend to hear about them either through other entrepreneurs who we've backed before or other venture funds who've backed before. So I think it's, for venture funds that are established, it's probably going to be quite a bit easier. If I was in San Francisco or Boston, I'm sure there is, going to be a lack of clustering because, people aren't just stopping by at the Starbucks or whatever the local coffee shop is and running into each other on the street. So they'll be feeling a little bit more like Ann Arbor, maybe.
So Phil, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the board of trustees at Dana-Farber, and we just spent on the trustee science committee talked about what's happening with the labs at Dana-Farber, and that's all of the hard, really good work that happens in the innovation cycle happens in the labs, and that's where a lot of the talent is, the PIs, et cetera, in those labs, talking to each other. Clustering is absolutely critical. Those labs are empty right now, and they're going to try to get them up and running soon. And if you had to go through that situation for 3, 4, 5 months, you are really going to slow down the research process. And by the same analogy, the clustering is just as important. Having investigators talking to each other within a company, next adjacent companies, clustering is going to be critical. Right now, you can't virtually run the experiments that you need to run to move research forward. So it's going to be, I think we're realizing how important it is more than ever because of this distancing issue.
I'd agree with that. I think if you're at very early stage in its company creation, that's where Boston really has it. It's not just the teaching hospitals, the universities, but there's an awful lot of capital in Boston. People know each other. It's easy to get together. And I think that ideation and that creative process and the entrepreneurial process does need some contact, and especially the labs have to be up and running. So I'm not sure that working from home would replace that. So I agree. I think clustering will remain important.
And as you think about investment strategies moving forward, for example, I've been working on an AAV COVID vaccine with Luke Vandenberg out of Mass Ioneer. I can't say that earlier in my venture career I've spent a lot of time on vaccine projects for reasons that I think we all understand. So as you think, maybe not over the next 6 months, but over the next 3 years or so, what are the categories that are going to see the most shift in becoming more attractive versus those that maybe will fall away a little bit relative to the environment that we're in today. So Jan, I'll give you the first cut again.
So again, we're much earlier stage, I think, than Chris and Phil. I think a lot of what we've been talking about with our advisors and with our CEOs from our companies. There's a lot of people already in the diagnostic space looking for the next COVID antibody, et cetera. So we won't go there because there's just way too much competition there. I think that, and the same in vaccines, honestly, probably in pharma, targeting the therapies. We like to find companies that are a little bit out of the norm and not kind of in an area where there's a lot of competition. Telehealth is a very interesting area to us, but specifically, we would probably look for it in certain disciplines, let's say GI or cardiovascular. Where we can bring some technology to the table that sort of enhances, if you will, the ability for a cardiologist or a GI physician to have a really good virtual visit with the patient. So there's going to need to be some technologies to allow them to get some data that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get just by talking to the patient, as an example. Mental health is another big area that we have a focus on, and in particular with telehealth and or other ways of trying to do that. We're actually an investor right now in a company called Pear Therapeutics that's actually in Boston. That's the first prescription digital therapeutic that provides ability to do cognitive behavior therapy on your phone to break addiction. As an example, there's other new technologies that they're going to be able to roll out that will help with other mental health issues, especially post-COVID, that a lot of people are going to be dealing with and needing very fast and efficient and efficacious ability to get therapy that is hard to do when you can't go see a psychologist or a counselor of some sort. So those are the kinds of things we're going to be looking for in the future.
Thank you. And so you don't always have to go last, Chris. I'll give you the next slot here.
I actually think there are a number of opportunities. One of the things that has slowed a lot of digital technologies down is just getting them adopted, particularly, and I'm conscious of who the audience is, but by the medical profession. It is sometimes very difficult because there's training time, there's cost, there's disruption. But I think one of the things we're seeing is that the healthcare system is actually hurting, as we've heard today. Visits are way down. We've got something like 240,000 physicians that have experienced significant decrease in their business. There's people actually out of work in that space. A lot of hospitals have seen a lot of revenue loss. In order to build the confidence, they're going to have to think about perhaps utilizing new technology. So there have been a lot of great technologies. It's been the adoption, and I suspect there's going to be a better environment for that. The other is, we've heard a lot of talk about clinical trials having to be accelerated and done differently. We've been doing clinical trials like we've been doing them for the last 50 years. And I think if we get into a lot more virtual signing up of patients and consenting and getting a different approach to clinical trials for COVID, that could actually seep out over into other therapeutic areas. And finally, there's been an unprecedented sharing of data and information just to be able to make the progress that so many people have made. I'm hoping that it's not going to take 6 months all the time to get a peer-reviewed journal published, and that we can't share information faster, because I think what we are seeing is that if we share data, we can accelerate science. So I think in all of this, it may be a difficult environment now, but if nothing else, there may be some good that comes out of that. And I think the therapeutic space and the digital health space are going to be good areas.
Yeah, and I just say, Jan and Chris hit the nail on the head. And telemedicine is going to be really important, and will stick, and speed. Things are going to get faster. Things are going to get more efficient because we've had to live in this environment.
Great, and we just have a few seconds left, but when you're in the middle of a crisis or a shift, you don't notice things that shortly after there seem obvious that we should have known during the time. So if anybody has any thoughts on, this is not the 2007-8 financial crisis, this is not 2001 again, it's a different kind of crisis. Any thoughts on something that you've thought of that we should be thinking about right now that's not on our minds? Whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I'm very passionate about it. I've lived through a number of pandemics, and every time we say, we got to be better prepared for the next one. We have a surveillance system for flu, but we don't have one for these types of things. So some of the money we're spending has got to be to actually be able to detect earlier when these pandemics are coming along.
I'd say,
I would-
stockpiling will be very, very important going forward, and that's a big lesson. I think the most shocking thing to me, which is that with all the social distancing that's happening, that we're not seeing a dramatic decline in the virus, the new case. Part of that's testing being accelerated, but I think part of it is we're not really isolating the patients. In Massachusetts, when you have 1,200 patients a day being diagnosed as new cases, and the governor isn't saying, well, we're going to put 1,000 of those people in a hotel room so they can't infect their family members or the people in their building. They're going back to their family members, sometimes in a 700 square foot apartment with 2 or 3 other family members or more. And I think that's where a lot of the infection growth is happening. And we need to analyze where these new infections are coming from outside the nursing homes, which is obvious, and understand that walking by somebody in the street may not be what's causing the problem. It may be something completely different, like family contact. They learned this in Wuhan pretty quickly. We learned this in Italy, the downside, in Lombardy. And I don't hear the governor talking about isolation. They talk about self-quarantining with family members sitting right next to you.
Thanks, Phil.
I'll just
Jan, like
add,
10 seconds if you had anything.
Yeah, just our whole public health system, in general, needs much better government support. People knew we didn't have enough vents in hospitals. They've known that for years. No, the US government never stepped up to try and fill those voids, and they absolutely need to going forward.
All right. Well, I really want to thank everyone. This has been a very informative panel. This is the last panel of the day, and so now I'll turn it back over to Chris so he can move towards closing things out. But thank you again for everyone.